Hello everybody. If anyone wants to just stand up and stretch their legs, now is the time to do it. I recommend it. Give yourself a wiggle. So first of all, I have a confession to make. Janet said she felt a bit intimidated. Well, how must I feel? I'm an English graduate. Yeah. But that's the point, isn't it? That the idea is everyone works together. I actually wanted to do A-level economics, and it was my big brother who cautioned me against it. He told me it was boring. So I did history instead, and that was boring. But anyway, the theme of this topic is a pearl of wisdom from Andy Haldane. Interrogating the numbers is one of the important mechanisms through which society can hold the executive to account. And even as an English graduate, I can concur. I'm the series producer and reporter with BBC Radio 4's More or Less programme, which explores the world through the numbers all around us, and we fact-check those numbers. And that frequently does involve holding politicians to account, politicians of all persuasions who can get a little bit creative with their number use, we notice. Now, the programme is presented by an economist, Tim Harford, who's on the front row there. He's there just to check my maths if I do get into any numerical episodes. He does have to do that. But the big the secret with More or Less is that actually most of the team, well, we don't really have many numerical qualifications between us. I have a GCSE in maths, but what we do have is our common sense and a curiosity. And I think really those are the two key tools that you need to make sense of numbers. And of course there are plenty of friendly experts, and we'll hear from some of them today, who will help us when those graphs do get a little bit complicated. You know, you can pick up the phone and someone can guide you through it. But you'll be pleased to hear that this afternoon we're going to be hearing from two highly qualified numerical whizzes. At the end, Todd Hartman, Senior Lecturer in Quantitative Methods at Sheffield University's Q-STEP Centre. Todd is a political scientist, so I think it'd be very interesting to get his perspective as another non-economist. And also next to him there is Jonathan Athau, Deputy National Statistician at the Office for National Statistics. I must say Jonathan is a real favourite with the More or Less team, because he's a rare breed who can make economic statistics sound like just such good fun. So you're in for a treat. But first we're going to hear from students from the University of Exeter about a project they've been working on outside their formal classroom course. And here to introduce them is Professor Carlos Cortines.
Right. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. And thank you, Wendy, for inviting me to come here. Now, before I introduce the students, I thought I'd provide a little bit of context. I'm one of the many academics who was profoundly dissatisfied with the traditional textbooks. So many years ago, when I started hearing about CORE, I jumped at the opportunity to get involved in the project. And the past 2 years, I volunteered to actually teach CORE to our first year, very large cohort, and I haven't looked back since. I actually looked at the student satisfaction of the year before I took over the course, and one of the statements was, I used to love economics, now I hate it. And I'm glad to report that since CORE was introduced, we don't get that kind of content. Now, when Wendy asked me whether I could bring a few students here, I decided to create an internal competition at the university, inviting students to apply to do a presentation about CORE. The brief I gave them was to give a short presentation using one of the units of the economics, at least. And it had to be a group presentation because economists are not very good at working in groups, so I wanted to force them to do so. I'm sure by now they're regretting the decision to enter the competition. They were told this was going to be a small gathering of people, but I assured them this was a very friendly group of people all around. So doing economics has been explained briefly before. I'm just going to go over it, how I use it in my classroom, and just giving you a little bit of context of what the content is. Now, some background about the need for this kind of resource. The academics in the room will not be surprised by this. I mean, if you look any employer surveys, and the Economics Network just completed one in 2019, most employers tend to say that economic graduates are really good at analytical skills, but they can't apply that to the real world. I mean, whenever you give them a new problem, they really struggle with it. And they also say that the ability to organize, interpret, and present the data is really, really important for them. Okay, so there seems to be a skills gap between what our economic graduates have and what the employers are looking for. At the same, on the same page, or the same side, the student surveys also tended to show that students, even now, still feel the economics they are learning is too theoretical, too quantitative, too model-based, and there's not enough real-life problems. And the first-year students, especially the ones I've been starting to teach, a lot of them had economics A level, others didn't. They tend to find the content boring, not challenging enough, and there was excessively overlapping with the A level, the high school content. So core kind of helps to address some of these contents by trying to close the gap between what people, what students, what employers want, and what we've been teaching them in the traditional sense. So the aims of the Doing Economics project was really to follow on the core project by providing students a hands-on experience using real data, getting their hands dirty with real problems from very early on. I mean, my first-year students from the first week start working with real data, downloading data from NASA and other institutions to actually see what the data looks like. We want to also provide a stronger link between real-world problems, things that they listen on the BBC News and other news providers, and the economic concepts they're learning in the classroom. In the old traditional textbook, this was always very difficult to do. You tended to add a footnote at the end of a concept you were trying to explain by saying, okay, this can be applied maybe in this sense, in that sense. With core and Doing Economics, it's kind of inverted the whole way of looking at this by starting with the real world problem, starting with data, and then try to explain what we see in that data. And also address another skills gap that a lot of economics graduates tend to have, which is IT skills, especially data analysis skills, and very often all the Doing Economics projects, empirical projects, are to be used with using Excel, R, and I'm sure there's plans to add other languages in the future. So the Doing Economics has got 12 empirical projects. These are aligned very closely to the 12 first units of the economy and the core ESPS. And it's a way for students to actually apply what they're learning to a real life problem. In my case, in the way I teach, I tell students they have to do 2 of these empirical projects per term, and they've got to study a problem in depth, not just by using the data, but also looking elsewhere, reading other articles, and so on. One of the projects they have to do is measuring climate change. It's not difficult to talk about climate change to 18-year-olds, but even they get really surprised once they start analyzing the data, transforming, and actually seeing how the data, what the data reveals about these important topics. As you can see, the topics covered in these projects are very wide-ranging. They're all real-life events, and now I'll just explain a little bit more in depth one of them, which is Project 11, which is the project that the students chose to do their presentation, which is going to follow this conversation. So each project has got a very detailed set of instructions. All these are freely available online. There's learning objectives, there's a series of tasks, there's also the solutions that students can actually investigate for themselves. A lot of the questions don't have unique answers, and that's one of the good things about it. We're not just telling students to press here, create this graph, and that's the solution. Students are really invited to think about the issues, to investigate more, and this is supposed just to be a starting point, not an end point on the problem. We teach students how economics can help solve the world's largest problems. Economics can be part of the solution, and this is really empowering for them. They tend to think that, again, in the traditional textbooks, in the traditional way of teaching this content, it's all about maths, all about the analytics. In the core, in the doing economics, is actually starting to try and think about how we can all help solve the big problems of the world, not just about indifference curves, not just about concepts which are very abstract. Students develop an understanding of how to create and interpret statistical tools from very early on. This is from first-year students, including fairly abstract concepts like spurious correlation, confidence intervals. Students use real data to actually see what these concepts mean. And I would say also they encourages critical thinking, because students are encouraged to question the data, question the sources, question the studies that are being shown in the media. And again, and this is my last slide, they learn to develop data analysis skill from very, very early on. So as I said, now we're going to be hearing from three students from Exeter, Jasmine, Gadiwalde, and Nariman, and they're each going to talk a little bit about Project 11, which is about measuring the willingness to pay for climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos, for your introduction, and thank you for having us today. We're so happy to be here. So this is Jasmine Khazibalwe, and I am Nariman. Today we want to talk about climate change and our willingness to pay for climate change. So the question we're going to be answering throughout the presentation is, how can governments measure support for climate change policies? So climate change is one of the biggest crises that is facing humanity today. And unless we pay for it, the situation is going to get worse. As we can see, like from just in 170 years, the temperatures have increased by 1 degree Celsius, which shows like how much the global warming is affecting our life today. And this is important because we can see it in our daily life. For example, in the beginning of this year, Australia faced one of its biggest bushfire in its history. 19 million hectares were burned. At least 34 people died and 1 billion animals were killed during this season. And even some endangered species were at risk of extinction. Not only that, but there are more heat waves, there's more droughts, the hurricanes are getting more and more intense, and even the countries that think they are climate change immune, they're not, because food supply depends on climate and other conditions. Well, there are some initiatives that were done to fight climate change, like international efforts. The UN holds a climate committee every year, like the Paris Agreement. And even on a local level, countries were trying to fight climate change, like France became the first country to ban supermarkets from throwing away or destroying unsold food. And Thailand kicked off 2020 by a plastic ban. We believe that there are two main reasons why climate change issues will keep on increasing. So first thing is because governments are not taking climate change as a top priority. Why is that? Because governments have three main priorities, which is, of course, economic growth, to maintain the confidence of markets, the welfare state in developed countries, and also national security, to protect the country from any external threats. Failure on one of these three priorities will cause the country to be in a national catastrophe. We all remember in 2008, 2009, how countries invested vast amounts of money to respond to this crisis. We've never seen this kind of urgency to climate change because governments do not see the benefits or risks in climate change issues. It's not a clear vision. And also, people are not willing to pay for climate change. And not willing to pay. They're not willing to pay enough for climate change. And we found some data on doing economics resource, having some data from Germany and asking people about their willingness to pay. Basically, it is the maximum amount people are willing to hand over for climate change issues. And that's what Jasmine is going to talk about now to explain how we can take this data and actually measure support for climate change.
Thanks, Nariman. Okay. Here we use survey data to answer the question, is there support for climate change mitigation? So we use the survey data to estimate the willingness to pay and to test people's characteristics and their attitude. So first question, where is the data come from? This data is come from a national online survey sponsored by German government, which on 2014, and the participants are aged from 18 to 69. They are required to answer several questions, which is government want to increase carbon emission reduction target from 13% to 14% by 2020. So we get this data, but before we give the willingness to pay, we estimated let's say very interesting and meaningful phenomena, which is people's attitude. Here, how worried are people about climate change? More than 16% people agree that there is a clear evidence that global warming is taking place. So nearly 14% people, they don't believe climate change is happening. And if you ask them how much they worried about climate change, and only 55% people said they are worried about climate change. Why we test people's attitude? Because we think people's attitude may influence their support rate for climate change mitigation. And if people don't believe climate change is happening, and if people don't care about climate change, therefore they won't want to pay much for climate change mitigation policy. And the next one is personal for belief 4. Do people feel personally responsible for climate change? If people are responsible, if people are responsible, they will think that Germany should take the responsibility for the global warming. And we can see that more than 14% people think Germany is jointly responsible for high global carbon dioxide emission. And nearly a half people feel obligated to take the impact of their daily activities on climate change into account. The last one is political preference. Do people think that government should have policy on climate change? Here we can see that nearly 16% people agree with the statement that as long as other countries do not reduce their greenhouse gas emission, climate change will still be a problem. And this kind of person afraid other countries get free riding. So therefore, they don't want to pay so much for climate change mitigation policies. And here we can see nearly a half the people agree with the government should stop dedicating to people how they should live. Because climate change mitigation policy is a kind of government intervention. People want to protect their own effect, and people want to protect their own interests and don't want governments to intervene their daily life. So they don't want, maybe they were against the climate change mitigation policy. Finally, how can we solve willingness to pay? Here, we use the dichotomous choice, which is called DC format. There is an example. Basically, we ask people how much you want to pay for climate change mitigation. We ask people some certain amount, and you answer yes, you want to pay, or no, you don't want to pay. You can see the right distribution. And here we can find that if you ask people a lower amount, they will be more likely to answer yes, they want to pay this for climate change. But if you ask them a higher value, they're more likely to answer no. So we collect this survey data and we get the result. We estimated willingness to pay from this survey is 192. But according to the latest think, if we want to meet the goal of the low carbon emission target by 2020, everyone at least need to pay 298 euro each year. So here we can see there is still a big gap between the willingness to pay we estimated and the willingness to pay we need, in fact. So how can we fix this problem? How can government policymakers learn from this survey data? Let's invite Gatti to talk with us.
So one of the main problems that we noticed and that Jasmine has already mentioned is that skepticism is one of the main reasons why people's willingness to pay for climate change mitigation might be too low. So the survey data showed that 80% of the people who scored highly on skepticism measures would vote against the policy to increase Germany's emissions reduction target and were not really willing to pay. So the way that you can address people's skepticism is to talk about it and to try and educate people. And in that way, a kind of tragic silver lining of us watching the climate crisis unfold around us is that people are talking more and more about climate change. It's becoming a key social and political issue. And we can see evidence of this from the increased media coverage of climate change. So for example, here in the UK, the top 7 newspapers wrote about 16,000 articles which mention climate change or global warming in 2019 alone. And we are starting to see more and more people coming out saying that they are worried about climate change. All through last year, we saw climate protests in different cities all around the UK. Furthermore, there are surveys are being done which people say that they are worried. A think tank called Bright Blue did a survey and they asked people if they were more worried about climate change. And over half the people said they were more worried about climate change in 2018 than they had been in 2008. And this kind of thinking is also happening within the government. The government seems to be putting climate change as more of a priority. We know that last year they officially legislated the net zero emissions by 2050 target, and the UK Parliament did declare a climate emergency. However, the Committee on Climate Change has said that the country is not currently on track to meet these goals. There are a lot of policies which there is a policy gap. So the policies which are currently in place are not enough. The committee has recommendations like encouraging the government to find a route to market for lower cost onshore energy production like wind or solar, or making sure that no biodegradable waste goes to the landfills, or even something simple like increasing planting trees from less than 10,000 hectares a year to 30,000 hectares a year. So with all this in mind, the government has a lot of opportunities coming up to actually introduce some more bold and ambitious policies which are in line with the idea of climate emergency and the net zero target. For example, the former Chancellor of the Exchequer did say that this year's spring budget would mention climate change. So we are waiting to hear about that. And we know that the UN climate talks are being held in the UK in Glasgow later this year as well. So I think a lot of people are hopeful that there will be more ambitious climate mitigation policies being put forward. However, if that does not happen, that is when we think that a survey like the one done in Germany back in 2014 would be absolutely vital, because at the very least, it can show that people are willing to pay some amount and take on a higher living cost in order to address the problem of climate change. And even if that amount turns out not to be enough, some of the other information from the survey can at least help the government to target and focus an awareness campaign. So we think that this kind of data is what could help to give the government confidence to move forward in a decisive way to solve this climate crisis. Thank you.
Thanks so much. That was really interesting. I'm so pleased you chose climate change as a topic, because I was surprised earlier on when, we saw that word cram. I was surprised that climate change wasn't bigger in that. So excellent. And just before I came here, I was actually writing a script for another programme about climate change and interrogating one of the numbers. So it's journalists and economists thinking the same. Again, this is great. To respond to that is, I'd like to invite Todd Hartman first. Todd is from Sheffield University, as I said, and he has lots and lots and lots of experience of conducting surveys and experiments. So I'd be very interested to hear a political scientist. And you've got about 5 minutes. I'll do that later.
Yeah, you could just let me know. So thank you, and thank you to the students for presenting. You're very brave to come up in front of this audience. I was also told that it was going to be a small gathering, and it's here in the Bank of England in a much bigger audience than I expected. But even though I'm a political scientist, I feel very welcome here. So yeah, I think the presentation was great. The projects are really interesting, and I think the thing that sells it for me is the applied nature of the work that you're doing, and in essence, the work that the CORE project has brought forward. I don't have any links to CORE other than sort of being aware of it because I'm part of the QSTEP Center and part of the Nuffield supported work that they're doing there. Been in the UK since 2014, and one of the missions that we've also done in the QSTEP program is to try and give students hands-on, applied, real-world problems, mainly because we found similar things, students coming in from social sciences saying, what do numbers tell us about politics, about sociology, about, a number of different things. I think you might have that problem a little less in economics. There's an expectation or maybe some stereotyping going on there. But certainly in my field, people often ask, why do we even need numbers to understand politics? What can that tell us? And I think having examples helps motivate that interest, right? So if you can give students examples and you can give them things that they care about, automatically they're interested, and then that helps motivate understanding. But more importantly, I think what it also helps do, and what we've seen here, is it helps develop skills, some real-world technical skills. And I think one of the great things about the CORE project is offering, both in Excel and Google Sheets and also R. So we use R at Sheffield, and many of the other QSTEP centers are moving to R to help develop those skill sets, both to make students employable. So when they go out on the job market, our students, even though we have smaller numbers probably than you do in economics, it's harder to get students to sign up to a quantitative social science degree, but the ones that do come out with real skills, and they can put on their CV or their resume that they can work with R, and they have these kind of skill sets that, oftentimes students coming from STEM or hard sciences also have technical skills, but they don't know how to apply them to real-world social problems. So it's really great to see, the kinds of work that you were doing and the examples about how we might link that up to doing additional survey work and gathering evidence. And I think ultimately this project, what makes it great, again, I don't have any links here, and she hasn't paid me to say this yet, at least I don't think, is that it's very difficult as someone who teaches to find good examples. There are plenty of examples on the UK Data Archive, and they say, here's a data set ready for teaching purposes, but oftentimes what you find is thousands and thousands of data sets to work through, and it's really difficult to find good examples that you can link into theory and concepts. You know, this particular example, there's measurement questions about how we measure concepts. There's an experiment here, a willingness to pay experiment. There's, you know, playing around with data, because that's another thing that happens. Oftentimes, when you work with students, you give examples to them that are perfect, that are ready-made. So they click a few buttons, they say, oh, that's great. And then when they try and go out in the real world, or they try and go out to work on their own projects, they struggle because they say, well, it's not so easy. You know, things don't work the way it's supposed to. So giving them real data, you know, in this case, data from a survey conducted in a probability-based sample in Germany, it's great data. Having them work with that and see that you have to, you know, recode some variables and you have to do some things that we often have to do right from the start is really a great thing. So I think, you know, we've talked a lot about economics today, but as somebody who's not an economist, I can see usage for this and you know, in my own quantitative social science program. I could easily see examples being drawn in politics or sociology. So I don't know what efforts have been made to do that, but I would encourage maybe some push or some steer outside of this to say, look, there's some really great examples here that could be used in your own classes, in your own fields, that, you know, although they have an economics, you know, badge to them, they're really about social problems, and, you know, the kinds of stuff that students could get from this would be really great. And so I'm hoping that, I know right now there are 11 or so examples. I'm hoping that additional data sets will be made available and other problems, because I think these sorts of things are really, really useful in developing skill sets and making it easier for people like me to do my job, to teach. And ultimately, you know, I think we want to make, you know, students that graduate both employable, but also, to make people quantitatively literate. You know, one of the other problems that we find is that most people have a hard time making sense of numbers and making sense of data in the real world, and you know, we try and say data is just evidence, and making people understand how to use that evidence, as students have done today, is great. So well done to everyone here, and thank you.
And now the Deputy National Statistician, Jonathan.
Right, thank you very much, and thank you very much to all the students who've presented. So I'm Deputy National Statistician, but actually I'm an economist pretending to be a statistician, although don't tell my boss. So I studied economics at undergraduate and did a master's, then joined the civil service and worked in policy departments before joining the Office for National Statistics. And there's a few sort of related points I want to make, but one of the things I do want to say is actually, as the Office for National Statistics, we don't see our role just in producing statistics for policymakers. We also see part of our role as facilitating democratic debate. We are there to put the information into the public domain that does allow policymakers to be held to account. Part of that is also educating people around how to best use data, what the data concepts mean. Sometimes it doesn't always mean kind of what it says on the what it says on the tin. But I just want to talk about, I've got sort of 5 messages and then one plug at the end. So I'm really passionate about how we can use data and economics to guide policy. Now, it doesn't always work particularly well. Politicians are free to ignore that and do something different, but it's really, really powerful. And I think I've seen enough examples of when that works together really well. Good data with good analysis, good economic analysis can really, really guide policy really effectively. Related to that, and something I'm really keen to talk about, because I'm in charge of economic statistics at the ONS, is that economics underpins measurement. The measurement choices and how we've gone around constructing those measures is absolutely underpinned by economics. You can see it in how we measure, in the concepts of how we measure inflation. We use concepts like opportunity cost in there. We appeal to consumer theory to think about how we weight together the elements of GDP. It's all there, and it's really, really powerful. So economics and analysis comes together, not just in what comes out, but in actually constructing the measures. Really very important. A second point I firmly believe is that explaining what these things mean really helps your understanding. If you have to write something down, if you have to condense it down, it really focuses your mind on what's the essential parts of these arguments. It's why I really enjoy the communication part of my role. I write blogs, I engage on Twitter, I occasionally get invited to universities, and I haven't been invited back. It's really about, when you're having to explain these concepts, how you distill them down is absolutely, it really tests your understanding. How can I find a way of taking this concept and working out what the essence of it is in a way that can communicate to people who may not have gone through all the training and all the learning I've done. So that's my second point, is explaining really helps understand. A third point is an aphorism I've used in the ONS, but I think it's more widely. If you can't sell it, why bother making it? If people don't understand what you're saying, if people can't accept it, why on earth have you bothered? And it's absolutely key that one of the really important things in the way we approach how we teach people, how we get people to engage with issues, is thinking about how they communicate it. If I'm honest, I would sometimes trade off some of the harder skills for some of those softer communication skills. Because often I've seen people do great work, really insightful work, but if they've struggled to communicate it to ministers, struggled to communicate it to the public, well, what's the point? So I really, really believe in the communication of our work to really get over that. Otherwise, why bother? And the communication I've seen today is exactly what I'm looking for from the students on that presentation and the other ones. Is exactly what I'm looking for. That's exactly the skills we need to be developing. One word that's come up a lot is the application of economic concepts. I think that is so important, but also so hard. I still think that is the most challenging part of this. And it's really, if you can find those examples where you can apply those concepts, it really helps with learning. But a lot of that is about bravery. And it's about giving students and everyone the confidence to engage with these ideas. Take a risk. Have a go. Try a technique in a new problem. And you might get some really, really interesting results. My last thought is one that I am also very keen on, and maybe it's because as I've gone through my career, I've become less and less skilled. I always used to joke when I left university, I could only think in algebra. I then went through thinking in Excel. I now, if I'm really, really stretching myself, I think in maybe a graph. Is keep it simple. I think there's something around making everything we do very, very simple and trying to say most of the concepts we do come down often to very, very simple thoughts. So before this job, I used to work in Revenue and Customs, the UK tax department. If we would look at thinking about taxes, there are two things with taxes. There's the base and the rate. There is nothing else. Everything else is one of those things dressed up in some fancy clothes. And always I'm interested in, if you've got a different tax forecast or if you've got a different number, is it a base effect? Is it a rate effect? What is going on? Keeping things simple is really very, very important. And I think it really helps people in terms of communication as well, if you can keep things simple. My last thought is a plug. So one of the things we are keen to do as the ONS is get more people in to work at the Office for National Statistics who can help us improve our statistics. Measuring the economy, measuring a modern economy, a globalized economy is really, really hard. And one of the challenges we face is getting people who can really engage and interested in the subjects we are working on. And one of the things we are doing, we've launched, in many ways we are copying a bit of how CORE has gone about it. We are developing an online economic textbook, measuring the economy. 3 chapters are up already, and looking at Tim to see if other chapters will be up. Very soon. Excellent. If you go to measuringtheeconomy.uk, you can find the first 3 chapters there. There'll be about, I think, by the summer, we're hoping to have pretty much the full suite of sort of 12 chapters, all different aspects of how we measure the economy, from things like GDP, inflation, but also things like regional economic performance through to income inequality, which we touched on earlier. And we're really passionate about that because we want a rich community where people can help us to improve how we do our job, and we can help the country make better decisions on the basis of that better data. So I think I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jonathan. And we have time for a couple of questions. A couple of short, sweet questions, as there is a coffee break for everybody to get to. Yes, the gentleman in the blue jacket at the top with his pen in the air. We'll just wait for the microphone, sorry, so we can all hear. Thank you.
Hi, Steve McKay, University of Lincoln. Just want to ask Jonathan if I could sort of pin you down a bit, and if you could talk me through an example where you found statistics numbers were quite helpful in persuading a minister or policymaker to perhaps change their thinking?
I would say it's often not necessarily changed, but it's sort of setting things up front. But one of the areas I worked on was following the referendum on Scottish independence. There was a decision to put more taxes in the power of the Scottish government. And actually there's an economic impact element to that. Think about the incidence of taxation. So there was a long debate about whether employers' national insurance should be delegated. But if you think about incidence of taxation is not necessarily who pays it, does it get passed through to wages? Those sorts of, it was a relatively simple economic concept about the incidence of taxation, played a role in thinking about, is that the right tax to delegate to the Scottish government. So that was a simple economic concept, nothing too fancy, but you think through the concepts about incidence of taxation against who pays, and that informed some of those decisions. So that's an example of one where nothing quantitative, no big maths, just some simple concepts applied, and you could think about a framework for should we delegate this tax to the Scottish government or not.
One more question. Who feels? The lady at the top there, sorry, I'm making you run up the stairs.
Thank you. Hi, I just wondered what the panel thought of having more mixed methods. So there were some surveys brought into the students' presentation on climate change, but what about having, say, like qualitative research as well to, to sort of flesh out some of the evidence in economics?
So maybe, sorry, I'll hog the microphone. I think that's really, really important. And as speaking as somebody who works in government, often we have got economist statisticians, but we've also got people like social researchers or applied social science. And actually, most of the time, you need all those skills brought together. If you're a policymaker, you don't really care whether it's an economist, a statistician, an operational researcher, or a maths graduate who's giving you the answer. You just want better evidence. And sometimes the stats or the economics tells you kind of what's happened, but it's that social science can also tell you why it's happened. What was the thought process that took somebody to those decisions? So I'm also very, very a big fan of doing things often in an interdisciplinary disciplinary way, because actually that gives you a more complete picture. That's a bit of a very there's much more nuance to it than that, but I think that's certainly my point.
Does anyone else want to come in on that?
I mean, I would just say that there's lots of different ways to answer a question. So, sometimes that's through quantitative evidence, sometimes through qualitative. So, we certainly are open to that, and we teach students how to use both.
Well, thank you. And thanks to you for your attention and all your excellent questions. There will be a coffee break, so if you've got pent-up questions, there will be an opportunity to ask our speakers. But thanks so much to the students and our speakers. Very interesting.